Okay, now let's look at get archives link and WP get archives. And as I mentioned, this is going to also include looking at some source code. And I'll just say when I was creating this, I was familiar with WP get archives, but I wasn't as sure what get archives link context should be used for. And so the process that I kind of went through for looking at this, I looked at what this was doing, and you had to pass it a URL and some text and the format that you wanted. And if you come down here, it doesn't really talk about how to use it, except it does walk through the different setups and what it can return. And what I was wondering is if you already have the URL to the archive that you want to link to, why is it that you have this function to help you with it? And really what I found after by looking around a little bit was that this is actually a helper function that's being called inside the other function that we are probably more likely to use. So the process for going through and finding all this out is I went into the general template file that you could look through online. So generaltemplate.php. And what I did once I got here was I just did a search for get archives links. And so I found where the function is being called, but I also see that there are multiple other instances of this occurring. So what I wanted to see was where else was this called? And if I start going through, notice that I will start to see it buried inside of other functions. And what this means is that if I scroll up to the top of where this appears, see this WP get archives? Inside of that, we're calling this as what is sort of a helper function. Notice that we're going to output some stuff and we're saying, hey, just get it to us in the format that we want and then give it to us. So what this means is that if WP get archives is calling the other one, we could potentially just use WP get archives. And in this case, the get archives link is probably not so relevant. Now, this was my process knowing some things about WordPress and PHP searching around, but I want to point out if it happens to you while going through things in WordPress that you can't figure out what something is doing, going through and searching through the original code can begin to help give you some hints, especially if you see that it's being called inside of other functions that might make more sense. So all that said, that was just to point out one of the scenarios that you may see. And let's look at WP get archives now, because that is going to be a little bit more helpful for us. So this will display archive links based on a bunch of parameters that we pass in, and we could either pass a string or an array with arguments. And we've looked at that format of how to set up arguments and pass them in. So when we see a bunch of arguments that are optional, so we can call it on its own, the type of archive, do we want a daily archive, weekly, monthly, yearly, post by post, or alpha? And that's just, it explains here what that is, different ways of displaying posts by title. The limit of them, so this is going to list out an archive, a bunch of archive links, and we could set it to be whatever limit we want, different formats, whether we want it to be a link, an HTML tag, an option for dropdown, before and after. We can see there's quite a lot of options here, the order, ascending, descending. And what you'll see is that in WordPress, a lot of these become familiar to you. So we've seen things like type, we've seen before and after, whether to echo it out. You'll see order and post type a lot. So these are going to begin to make more and more sense, and you'll become more and more familiar with different types of arguments that we can use. But let's just code some out real quick, because we want to see WP get archives in action, and then talk about whether we'd really want to use it versus other ways that we might be able to accomplish something similar. So what I'm going to do is come into my sidebar.php, and above my dynamic sidebar, which is controlled by widgets, I'm going to add in some hard-coded information here. So this is a point where we'll circle back to and talk about whether this is the right approach to take versus using widgets or something dynamic, but let's just set it up and then we'll talk about it from there. So the first thing we have to do is set up the arguments that we want to pass, and you could go back and forth and look at these. I'm just going to show you a few of them here. And the first one we'll do is a yearly, so we could just see what a yearly archive looks like, and we can set a limit to it. This may or may not be necessarily relevant, but let's just say a limit to 3 to see what happens there. Another one that you may end up using is show post count, and you could set that equal to true, and that's going to show how many different ones are in that. And let's set order, that's another one, is descending. Okay, so let's just, those are our arguments. We still have to call the actual function here. So let's do WP get archives. And then we could see it's passing in arguments. We already have that set up, so we could just run that just like that. Now let's pop open our site and take a look at our sidebar. Okay, so if I come over to my blog now, notice that I see a list with no heading, so we may want to add something there. But we see a link to the yearly archives with how many posts are in each one, and it's limited to 3. So that's pretty awesome. Let's customize this real quick, just one time so you can get familiar with some of the changes that you might make. So let's come over here and let's do a weekly one instead and change this to 10 and ascending. So just playing with some of the different options there. And again, you can go back to the parameters and tweak this a little bit more if you like. So looking at that now, notice that we link to weekly archives with an idea of how much it is. It's limited. We still don't have a header. We'd want to put that in, but that is working. Now, is this what you want to be doing? One of the downsides to taking this approach is you could also potentially get the same effect by using the customizer and widgets. So these are dynamic widgets that you could control through the front-end customizer and the admin area. This is not. This is hard-coded into your theme. So if this is a feature that the user might want to move around or change or remove later, hard-coding it, what I'm going to call hard-coding it, meaning that they can't go in and pull it out without removing the code, is probably not the approach to take. However, if this is something that you do want to include and not have them be able to mess with, then this is definitely the approach because they won't be able to go into the customizer and remove it. And later on in the course, when we get into hooks and plugins, you'll also learn that we could dynamically create these and add them onto the page, or maybe create our own widgets and use this code behind the scenes to give the people what they want and make it accessible in that kind of widget drag and droppable area. So just to talk about the approach and whether you'd want to do it along with how to do it if it is the right approach. Okay, so at this point with archive tags, I would suggest a little bit of practice. Like I keep saying, we're going to do a larger practice at the end of general template tags, but it would be a good idea to just go through, create the basic templates that you need to play around with these, prove for yourself that it is true, look through the source code that I showed you and see what makes sense and what doesn't. Either way is fine. And then practice using some of these, especially like WP Get archives and playing with the different types of archives, just so that even changing a few parameters here and refreshing it in your browser, you'll remember what is possible a little bit more. So take the time to practice a little bit. And then next up, I'm going to show you briefly looking at the calendar tags that we get access to inside of WordPress.